When it comes to sex, we all kind of feel like we know what's normal, right? But what does the data actually say? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and look at the real numbers behind our most intimate behaviors. So let's dive in and see how reality stacks up against what we think we know. All right, first question, and it's a big one. Go ahead, take a second, and think about it. How many times a year do you think the average person has sex? Like once a week? Twice? Get a number locked in your head because I'm betting the answer is going to surprise you.
And there it is, 103. That's the magic number. According to the Durex Global Sex Survey, that's the worldwide average for a year. I mean, that's basically twice a week. But here's the thing. That number is just the starting point. The really interesting part is how crazy different it is depending on where you live.
And I mean, look at this range. It's massive. On one end, you've got Greece coming in hot at 138 times a year. And then way down on the other end is Japan with just 45. That's a 93-time difference. It just goes to show you how much things like culture, stress, and just, daily life can totally shape our sex lives. So let's stick with this global perspective for a bit. In our first section, we're going to take a global look at our most intimate behaviors. And we'll start with some basic stats that kind of paint a picture of what's happening out there, starting with, when it all begins. So get this, the global average age for losing your virginity is 17.3 years. And what's really interesting is that the trend is definitely pointing younger. Like the 16 to 20-year-olds in the survey, their average starting age was even lower, down at 16.3. And just like how often people have sex, when they start varies like crazy. Check this out. In Iceland, the average is just 15.6 years old. That's almost 2 years younger than the global average. But then you look at a place like India, and it's almost 20. That's a 4-year gap. It really shows how different that journey into sexuality is for people all over the world. Okay, so we've talked about how often and when. The next obvious question has got to be with how many people. And yeah, this is another one where what we assume might be totally different from the real data. So, the global average number of sexual partners in a lifetime? It's 9. But like everything else, the real story is in the details. You've got folks in Turkey and Australia reporting the most partners, averaging over 13. And then on the total opposite end of the spectrum, you have China and India, with an average of just 3. What a difference. All right, next up, the orgasm gap. This is a data-driven look at pleasure inequality. So we've talked a lot about quantity, how much, how many. Now let's switch gears and talk about quality. Let's talk about pleasure. There was this huge US study that uncovered something they called the orgasm gap, and it shows a pretty big difference in who's actually finishing the race, so to speak. So, is there really an orgasm gap? I mean, it seems like a simple question, right? But the answer is, it's complicated. Does this gap exist between men and women? And what happens when you factor in sexual orientation? Let's see what the big survey had to say. Whoa, okay, the data here is pretty undeniable. A whopping 95% of straight men say they usually or always orgasm. Now compare that to straight women, where the number plummets to 65%. That is a 30-point gap. But here's where it gets really interesting. Look at the data for lesbian women. 86%. That's way closer to the men's number and way, way higher than heterosexual women. So the big question is, how do you close that gap? Well, the good news is the research is actually super specific about this. Women who orgasmed more often reported a few key things: more oral sex, longer sessions, and better communication. Things like praising their partner or just straight up asking for what they want. The takeaway seems to be that it's not about just one thing. It's about mixing it up and making sure everyone's pleasure is a priority. Okay, part 3, desires and experiences. We're going to explore fantasies, encounters, and kink. Because, let's be real, sex is way more than just intercourse and orgasms, right? So now we're going to dive into the data on what people fantasize about and what they're actually doing. What goes on in our heads can be a whole different world from our day-to-day lives. And it turns out, pretty much all of us, like 95%, have sexual fantasies. A threesome, that's on the minds of a huge 82% of men. And check this out, 70% of people have fantasized about a stranger. And 65% of women have fantasized about being dominated. I mean, our inner worlds are clearly pretty wild. So, okay, fantasies are one thing, but how many people actually act on those kinds of spontaneous urges? Well, globally, 44% of adults say they've had a one-night stand. That's almost half the population. It's a way more common experience than you might think. And it's not just one-night stands either. People are exploring all kinds of desires, which is kind of changing how we look at certain things.
Yeah, for the longest time, things like BDSM, consensual stuff involving power dynamics, bondage, roleplay, it was all seen as super taboo or even like something was wrong with you. But there's been a really big shift. Now, there's this whole growing field in psychotherapy that's trying to destigmatize it all, to understand kink not as some kind of problem, but just as another perfectly valid way for people to express themselves sexually.
So how common is this stuff really? Well, the numbers are probably a lot higher than you'd guess. 1 in 5 people, 20%, have participated in BDSM activities. 22% have tried role-playing during sex, and more than a third of people have engaged in anal sex. So yeah, this isn't some fringe thing. It's part of the normal sexual landscape for millions and millions of people.
Okay, last section, health and reality check. Time for the practical and surprising side of sex. Let's bring it back down to earth a little bit with the reality check. We're going to cover everything from contraception to some trends that honestly might not be what you're expecting.
So on a global scale, about 64% of women in their childbearing years are using some form of contraception. But flip that around. That means more than a third are not. And that obviously has huge implications for things like unplanned pregnancies and STIs. It's just one number, but there's a really complex story behind it.
Okay, prepare to have your mind blown. This is a number that always gets people. The average duration of penetrative sex is just 5.4 minutes. No, seriously, not 20 minutes, not an hour, 5.4 minutes. This has got to be one of the biggest gaps between what we see in movies and what's actually happening in real life.
And here's the trend that really goes against the grain. We always hear that we're living in this super hypersexualized world, right? Well, in the US, people are having less sex, a lot less. Back in 2000, more than half of adults were having sex at least once a week. Fast forward to 2018, and that number dropped to just over 37%. It's true, we're actually having less sex now than we were 20 years ago.
I think this quote really nails it. Dr. Barry McCarthy said, "In sexuality, one size never fits all." And that perfectly sums up everything we've just looked at, doesn't it? From how often, to when you start, to what you fantasize about. The only constant is that there is no constant. There's no single normal. It's just this huge, incredibly diverse spectrum.
And that kind of brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. All this data we've gone through today, it pretty clearly shows that our assumptions about sex can be way, way off. And it really makes you think, right? If we can be this wrong about something so fundamental to being human, what else don't we know? It's a pretty good reason to stay curious and to keep questioning the things we think are just normal.